Maybe we should wait 1 or 2 more minutes because some people haven't gotten on yet.
What I'll do is I'll give an introduction and maybe some more people will join us. The introduction is not part of the shir itself. It's just a separate introduction. We're in a period of time because of the extra Adar, which is sort of, as we say in Yiddish, nishtaher, nishtahin, it's not here or there. You know, we're not really ready for Purim yet. And we don't have another holiday immediately looming in the distance. Hegyonei Halacha has been our book, Rav Mirsky Shlita. This has been our sefer for the last couple of months, and I enjoy it tremendously. And it's dedicated to the Moadim. What do I do in this period of time? But then I realized that Hegyonei Halacha has a wealth of material for Purim. And they belong really in two sections. One is about Amalek, and the other is about Purim itself. And it's a wealth of material. So I figured if instead of being pressured before Purim to have to fit in our once-a-week shir all that material, I figured let's start early. We'll have perhaps a 2-part series on Amalek, and then go on to Shkolim, Parsha Shkolim, which is at the beginning, you know, at the end of Adar Aleph, and then go on to Purim. So without further ado, we're studying now Chelek Bet, the second section of Hegyonei Halacha. It's a three-volume work. And we're looking on page 154, which is about the battle, the Milchama against Amalek. The Torah tells us at the end of Parshas B'Shalach that Moshe Rabbeinu appointed Yoshua to choose an army, a battalion of Jewish soldiers to go out and battle Amalek. Bechar lanu anoshim v'yetzei hilachem b'Amalek. Now, the question we're asking today is, who are these people that Yoshua is going to choose? Rashi indicates that these are Giborim v'yirei chet. Interesting how the religious, or shall we say, spiritual profile of a person plays such a major role in a battle, in a war. And Rashi adds a few important words here. He tells us, number one, that the schus of their Yira Shamayim, their heavenly merits, will be Misayatam. That will help them win the battle. But Rashi tells us something else, which is going to call our attention. And that is, we need people, sheyodim levatel kshafim. Now, we know that the Talmud is full of discussions about Kishuf, not only in terms of the violation of Kishuf, but in terms of the power of sorcery. It may be, according to some, that power of sorcery is no longer active in the universe. But back in the day, it was a very powerful force. And certain members of Chazal would be able to protect against Kishuf. And Rashi says, why do we need amongst the soldiers, those who are Yodim Levatel Kishufam? Rashi says, Lefisha b'nei Amalek mechashven. They are mechashven. We're going to try to find the source for this Rashi and try to analyze, number one, what was the Kishuf of Amalek? Was it unique? What was the connection between Amalek and Kishuf? And number two, how do we counter who are these individuals who have the power, the ability to be Mavatel Kishuf? Those are our two questions. Now, we're going to study a statement in the Yerushalmi in the third parak of Rosh Hashanah. And this is apparently the source for Rashi's conclusion that the Amalekim were Mechashv. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Omer, Amalek Koshfan, which is the Aramaic conjugation of nechashe for you. What was the method of kishuf that was employed by Amalekim to protect them in battle? They would send out to the battlefield members of Amalek on their birthday. That's an interesting way of celebrating your birthday, is it not, to go out to the battlefield? And why is this? Because there's something called Mazel Hasholet Li'ozro Shel Adam. There is an angel called a Mazel, some heavenly force above that protects a person. And dafka on the day of his birth, on the day of one's birth, that's when the Mazel is particularly effective and protects a person. And that means that if there's impending danger, the malach of the Mazel on a person's birthday will protect that person against the forces of mazikim that try to bring him down. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu understood, and so did Yoshua, his Talmud Muvak, that this was the method employed by Amalek. That's why they were successful in the military campaigns, because they would send out to the battlefield those Amalekis on their birthday so that the Mazel would protect them on their birthday. So what did Moshe Rabbeinu do? How did he figure out a way of countering against Amalek? And it means sometimes you have to utilize the method of your enemy, and that's exactly what he did. What Moshe was able to do was he was able to have an impact on the mazalos, on the constellations and the structure of the stars up in heaven. Now, again, I don't know how to interpret this Yerushalmi. Neither do I understand much about Kishuv. I know even less about mazolos. How can you change the mazolos in such a way that on a person's birthday, the mazel will not be able to be sholet, it cannot be effective, and therefore will not protect the individual on his birthday? But somehow, Moshe Rabbeinu was able to do so. The Yerushalmi doesn't tell us exactly how. We're hoping that as we go through some of the source material, we begin to understand how Moshe could contend against the power of Kishuv of Amalek, and Dafka when the Amalekis went out on their birthday. Comes along the Chizkuni and sheds an amazing light on this parsha of how Moshe protected the Jewish soldiers against the Amalekim. But in order to appreciate the Chizkuni, we have to point out that there's something called Adar Sheni. Now, again, in Halacha, we have many, many issues about which Adar is the real Adar. But suffice it to say that for our purposes today, in understanding Chizkuni, the real Adar is Adar Aleph. Adar Beis is what you'd call an annex. It's auxiliary, it's secondary, it's not really part of the 12 months of the year. There are only 12 months in a year. Adar Sheni, I don't know what to call it a fill-in. It's a filler. And the nafkamina is that Adar Sheni does not belong to the mazalos. The mazalos, which are 12 in number, correspond to the 12 months of the year that end with Adar Aleph. Adar Sheni is not influenced by mazalos. And therefore, says the Chizkuni, who did Moshe Rabbeinu choose to be at the front lines of the Jewish military brigade to fight against Amalek? None other than Jews who are born in Adar Sheni. So you're cutting down your pool of soldiers in a very specific way, very limited, restricted number, because first of all, you have to have someone who was born in Adar. I mean, that's 1 out of 12. But the fraction is a very small fraction when you're talking about someone who was born in Adar Sheni. I don't know if there's anyone here today on Zoom or wants to admit that he was born on Adar Sheni.
My wife.
Your wife. Okay. I don't know if women go out to battle against Amalek. That's quite a sugya unto itself.
On Adar Sheni Zion.
So what happens now? Kishuv can only activate 12 mazolos corresponding to 12 months, but Kishuv does not have any impact on the mazel of Adar Sheni, because Adar Sheni is not included in the 12 mazolos. And therefore, if Adar Sheni has no mazel, because it's an addendum and an auxiliary month, anyone who is born in Adar Sheni is not impacted by Kishuv, because Kishuv is a particular manipulation of the mazolos. So when you have someone who belongs to the mazolos, you can manipulate the mazolos through Kishuv, and you can defeat such a person. But in the case of someone who is born in Adar Sheni, he is not influenced by mazolos, and therefore Kishuv could have no power over him. So that Moshe Rabbeinu and Yoshua appointed those who were born in Adar Sheni. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the Kishuv of Amalek. We have a pasuk in Shmuel Aleph in Perek Tes Vav, and we don't understand that pasuk, but it'll give us an insight into the Kishuv of Amalek. When Shmuel HaNavi commands with the divine mandate Shaul HaMelech to destroy Amalek, he says, Meishar v'ad seh, migamal v'ad chamor. Destroy Amalek totally. Man, woman, children, animals, the oxen and the camels and the donkeys. What's the big deal about the animals? So much emphasis on the animals. And the answer is that these were not animals at all. They may have looked like animals, probably smelled like animals, but they weren't animals. They were human beings. They were Amalekim. Because the Kishuv of Amalek was able to convert human beings and make them look like animals. And in this way, the Amalekim were banking. They were betting on the fact that these animals will get by. The Jews will not kill the animals. And instead, the animals will kill the Jews. And that would be the Kishuv method that would, on the one hand, protect the Amalekim, and on the other hand, give them the ability to destroy the Jewish people. But if that be the case, Shmuel comes back to Shaul HaMelech and says, why didn't you fulfill the mandate of God to destroy Amalek totally, utterly? And the answer of Shaul is Vayachmol ha'am al meitav hatzon ve'habakar. Wait a second. Did Shaul understand the Kishuv of Amalek? We know that in the first battle against Amalek, with Moshe and Yoshua and Parshas Beshalach, the Jewish people knew how to contend against and reveal the secret of the Kishuv of Amalek. If the same parallel logic would apply to the second battle against Amalek, namely Shaul HaMelech's battle against Amalek, then he certainly understood and knew that we got to be careful about the animals, because those animals are really Amalekim in disguise. And therefore, it makes a lot of sense that if the Jewish nation defeated Amalek under the leadership of Shaul HaMelech, they certainly destroyed the animals. And yet Shaul HaMelech tells us that they had compassion on the animals. What do you mean compassion on the animals? These are your enemies. These are Amalekim. This is Gufo Shel Amalek. These are not possessions of Amalek. These are the bodies of Amalek. So what's Vayachmol Ha'am? And for this, we're going to learn an unbelievable chiddush in a book called the Sefer HaChasidim that dates back 5 centuries ago. He says the following, that every kishuf has a weakness to it, a soft spot where if you know how to attack that kishuf, you can take that kishuf down. There are different forms of kishuf, maybe water, different things that you could do. When it comes to the kishuf of Amalek, there's a way of identifying which animals are animals and which animals are human beings in the form of animals. And it all lies in the eyeballs. Truth is in the eyeballs. Because this kishuf has one limitation. It cannot change the eyeballs of a human being and make them look like the eyeballs of an animal. Do you hear me, Rabbosai? Which means that if you look at the animal and you know the secret, which the Sefer HaChasidim knew, you can identify animals and human beings and differentiate between the two, even though they look identical, because they aren't identical. Look at the eyeballs. And therefore, Shaul understood that we have the secret and we can identify which are Amalekim in the disguise of animals and which are animals. Just look at the eyeballs. So what they did is they checked out the animals that they knew were really human beings and they killed them. Then there were animals that were really animals. They were not Amalekim. But here Shaul HaMelech failed to fulfill his obligation to destroy even the animals of Amalek. So when the pasuk tells us in the name of God, Shmuel, that you should destroy Mishar, V'yadsem, Mikamal, V'yad Chamor, it means destroy all the animals, not only the Amalekim in disguised as animals, but all the possessions of Amalek. And by the way, that's the halacha to this day, that we're not allowed to benefit from anything that belonged to Amalek. Tachrim, we have to destroy Amalek totally, utterly. Okay, now we're going to see how this sheds a light on a parsha in Bamidbar Chaf Aleph. And if you're following me in the text, we're in the main body of the paragraph on page 155. Vayishma Knani, please underline the word Knani, Melech Arad, Yoshev HaNegev, Ki ba Yisrael derech hatarim v'yilachem b'Yisrael v'yishav mimenu shevet. There was a battle against Melech Arad, who's identified as a Knani. And he lives in the Negev in the south. And when the Jewish people came up from the south, they were attacked by this Knani, this nation whose king was Melech Arad. Rashi says, on this pasuk in Bamidbar Chaf Aleph, Rashi says, who were these guys in the Negev? Which Knaanim were in the south? There were no Knaanim in the south. Who was in the south? The Torah tells us that the Amalekim were in the south, but it says here, Vayishma Knani Melech Arad. So we're talking about a Knani, and Rashi identifies him as an Amaleki. Well, as we say in our parlance, take your choice, buddy. Either they're Amalekim or they're Knaanim. You can't have your cake and eat it too. The pasuk identifies them as Knaanim, and Rashi says they were Amalekim. Vikenda sign. It's Amalek Yosef B'Eretz HaNegev. Rashi's right that there cannot be Knaanim in the Negev. The Torah testifies that it's the Amalekim are in the Negev, but yet the Torah identifies them as Knaanim. And the answer is explained by a number of commentaries that this was again another manifestation of the Kishuv powers of Amalek. And Amalek converted themselves physically, their bodies, to look like Knaanim. Veshina Amalek Lishono, they were even able to, through Kishuv, to change the sprach, as we say, and get a Knani accent. Instead of speaking Amalekism, they spoke Knanis, not Chinese, Knanis, I said. And now the Jewish people think that they're dealing with Knaanim. And this is another ploy of Amalek. And, you wonder about the Amalekim. Do they have any appreciation for spirituality, for that which is Ruchani? Well, here's a case that'll prove that Amalek understood something about spirituality, and namely about tefillah, about prayer. We have a rule. It's almost like a halacha in Hilchos tefillah, that tefillah has to be precise and it has to be truth. Otherwise, you're not going to get the results of tefillah. The ploy of Amalek was that the Jewish people would use their power against Amalek, which is the power of tefillah. You remember Moshe Rabbeinu in the first battle against Amalek lifts up his hands, and that's tefillah. But their tefillah would be, God, please save us from the Knaanim. The Knaanim are attacking us. And that tefillah is not going to, it's an arrow that won't hit the mark because they're not Knaanim. These are Amalekim. However, the Jewish people were a little bit more clever. They noticed that these Knaanim, in quotation marks, who were speaking Knanis, did not have the dress of the Knaanim. Apparently, the Kishuv didn't go that far. And in fact, they were dressed like Amalekim. So they understood that, you know what? We're not fighting against the Knaanim. We're fighting against the Amalekim. So what do? They davened bistam. And it says, Vayidar Yisrael neto Hashem v'yomer im nason titein es ha'am hazeh biyadi v'echrabti es areim. Look at those words. Ha'am hazeh. They didn't mention the nation. They didn't say Haknanim ha'elu. They said Ha'am hazeh. They suspected, and they were perfectly on the mark, that these were Amalekim. And their tefillah protected them, and they survived the battle against Amalek. Okay. Now, if you're with me up until this point, we're ready for the real, I call it Gishmak. I mean, what we're about to learn, I'm telling you, it's Me'ein Olam Haba. And I'm not dramatizing it. It's unbelievable. And this is all very, very new to me. Purim, as you know, is called Purim, Al Shem HaPur. Now, that's a little bit strange because Pur is a reference to the Gorol, to the, what's the English translation of a Gorol? A lottery, we'll call it a lottery, maybe I have a better word for me, to the lottery of Haman. It's very strange, every holiday has a name that introduces and reflects the mess, the miracle of that day. Pesach, that God skipped over the Jewish Bechoros, and Sukkot, that he put us in the Sukkot, and so forth. And so what's the name Purim? On the Pur of Haman. And what we're going to find out now, that Purim is all about Hishtanus Dmuyos acheros, meaning it's all about wearing a facade. A mask. So today what we want to do is unmask Purim. There was a milchama against Amalek, and it's all v'nafochu. Esther says to Achashverosh that Haman tried to destroy every last Jew amongst us. The king, Achashverosh, gets up from the festive meal. He's in a state of anger. And he goes out El Ginas Habison. He goes out to the guard of the palace. And the Chazal tell us on the Pasuk Ve'hamelech Shav Miginas Habison, the Gemara says in Megillah Tezayin, Makish Shiva Lekima. It says Hamelech come, Vamelech Shav. Makima Bechema, Af Shiva Bechema. So the Gemara says, what's the chiddush here? He was angry when he got up from the table, and then he was angry when he came back from the Ginas Habisan. What's this new element here of anger? What's it all about? But what happens is that Haman goes out to the garden, the Gemara tells us, and he sees people, well, we think they're people, who are ripping up the garden. They are uprooting the trees in the garden. The beautiful...
Not Haman, Achashverosh, you mean?
I meant to say Achashverosh. Achashverosh goes out to the garden. He thinks that he's looking at human beings who are uprooting the trees in his beautiful kingly garden. And he asks these people who are really malachim. Again, everything is about wearing a mask. These are malachim who showed up in the form of human beings, and they respond, my master, the king, Haman told us to destroy the garden. So now there's a new reason why Achashverosh is angry at Haman on his way back in. Shayu okrim esilanos hagan, amalehem amelech mama sechem paveshivu Haman hakad aleinu lakar seilanos. And lefichach shav bechem. Okay, again, another manifestation of this idea of somebody showing up and in a guise to try to fool you. But this is a good thing that the Malachim showed up in the guise of human beings. But it goes beyond that. Hey, do you guys remember the song V'gam, 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 v'gam? I always go wild on this song. I was always a big fan of Charbona. Charbona was my, I once slept in a bed of one of my Talmidim from Dallas, Texas. He was here in Israel, and I was visiting Dallas, Texas to recruit for our yeshiva. So they put me up in Dallas in his bed. Right next to his bed were gigantic posters of the greatest, sports heroes you can imagine. In Texas, they're really big into sports. My hero in life was always Charbona. I always wanted to know, what does this Charbona look like? And then I sing V'gam, V'gam. Well, those days are behind me. I'm no longer going to sing the praises of Charbona. Charbona was a Rasha. Charbona was an evil person who was one of Haman's henchmen and had no desire in life other than to destroy the Jewish people. But what's the story over here? It says in the pasuk, "Vayomer Charbona, echad misarisei hamelech, tigam ha'etz asher hine ha'etz asher asa Haman leMordechai omed bebeis Haman gavoach hamishemama." Says the Gemara Megillah and Daf Tezayin, Amar Rabbi Elazar af Charbona Rasha, the osa eitza haya. He wanted to get Mordechai up on that tree. He's just waiting for that day. But Kevon Shara Shalonis Kaimat Soso Miad Bara. So he's out of the picture. He sees that Haman is not, he doesn't want to be Haman's right-hand man. So who is this guy who's telling the king that this is the tree, Gavah Chamishim that Haman planned to hang Mordechai? And who is it? It can't be Carbona, but the pasuk says, Vayomer Carbona. Says the Medrash in Yalkut Shimoni. Bi'osa Shabbat Elio Zocher Latov V'nidme L'Charbona. He appears in the guise of Charbona. So it's not only true that the Malachim showed up in the Gina of the Melech as human beings, but in that same enterprise, that same Iruah, it was Mordechai, it was Elio who shows up in the guise of Charbona. This is the mask of Purim, my friends. And therefore, according to one girsa, we should not say Charbona Zachur Latov in Shoshanas Yaakov, but rather Zachur Latov, Elio Zachur Latov. I mean, that's going to change the whole niggin, because it was Elio who showed up to save the day and tell the king where is Haman's mind at. You know, he's destroying Mordechai, Asher Diber al Tov al Amalek, etc., etc. And where do we see this in the Megillah? There's an amazing problem about how to spell the name Carbona. We have Shnei Ksuvim Machichin said that. Do you spell Carbona with a hey or with an aleph? We're now on page 157. At the beginning of the Megillah, there are 7 Sarisim Yamelech, Hamacharsim Yamelech. Charbona is spelled with an aleph at the end, as if it was a Yiddish name. You know, in Shemus and Gittin, there's always the issue, you know, whether, and it's also in Ksuba. You should be mocked in a Ksuba. I remember when my wife, when we wrote up my wife's Ksuba, so she spells her name with a hey at the end, Charna. And Rav Soloveitchik was at Masada Kedushin. He insisted to write it with an aleph at the end, because Charna is really from another language. Now, when it says that Charbona echad misarisa mehine ha'etz asher asa hamelech leMordechai, so we're now fast forwarding from Perak Aleph of Megillah Esther, where Charbona appears with an aleph at the same. Fast forward 7 chapters to Esther Perak Zion, and Charbona is now telling the king at the banquet, this is the eights that Haman prepared for Mordechai. There, the name Charbona appears with a hey at the end. And as I said before, you know, take your choice. Do you spell Charbona with an aleph or with a hey? So for this, we need one of the most important principles in Hilchos Gittin and how to write names in Gittin. I spent almost a year of my life studying how to write names in a Gittin. Did I ever tell you the story? I was so into Shemos at that time because I was studying Shemos with Harav Eliezer Lippman Cohen, Zichron Levracha. He was the expert in Shemos in America, but he was settled in Eretz Yisrael. So in Eretz Yisrael, I studied with him the laws of Shemos, and I was so into it. My wife and I once got into a cab, and we had a lot of Judaic at that point that we had brought from America. We had it in the back of the trunk. Anyway, during the course of the drive, as I always did, I asked the cab driver, they're mostly Sfaradim, I asked him what his name is. He said Nisim. I said, wait a minute, Nisim with a mem at the end or Nisim with a nun at the end? I was a big shop because I was learning Shemos. So he told me it was Nisin with a nun at the end. I'm telling you a story from almost 40 years ago. And I didn't create the story just for this purpose. This really happened. Anyway, we get out of the cab and he drives away and our stuff was in the back. How do you find a cab driver? It's like number one, Jerusalem. I remembered his name was Nisin with a nun at the end. And that's how we were able to track him down and get back our very precious Judaica. In any event, how do you spell Charbona? So the Beis Shmuel has a famous principle. And all of Hilchos Gittin revolves around this principle. If the name is Lashon Kodesh, it's got a hey at the end. If it's Lashon Laz, it comes from another language, you write it with an aleph at the end. Charbona is a name from a different language. It is not Lashon Kodesh, and therefore Charbona is written with an aleph, as it appears in the first chapter of Megillas Esther. So why does Charbona appear with a hey at the end in Perek Zayin? The answer is that's not Charbona. That's a Jew by the name of Eliyahu HaNavi. And he took on a Hebrew name, Charbona. And Chazal talk about the meaning of the word Charbona with a hey at the end. My bosa, I'm telling you, you can make a Birchas Hanenim on this shtickle Torah. So now we see that the miracle of Purim revolved and developed from all these kinds of hisdamiyos lidmuyos acheros, whether it's the case of the malachim who showed up in the guise of human beings, and that got the anger of Achashverosh against Haman, whether or not you're talking about someone who's really not Charbona, who looks like Charbona, but it's really Eliyahu HaNavi. And you begin to understand and appreciate why we wear masks on Purim. I couldn't get over this. Masks on Purim. It's crazy. The Ramah, they testify about the Ramah, who died at a very young age, that he wore a mask on Purim. And this you'll see on page 158. It says that the Ramah died at the young age of 33. It's just mind-boggling what he accomplished in such a short lifetime. He died on the 33rd day of the Omer, and he wrote 33 works. And when the eulogizer, anyone who's learning Daf Yomi, there's a special, trade called the eulogizer. He got up and he found 32 ways of praising the Ramah. Anybody have a cash on that? The magic number is 33. Why 32? So an elderly person came in and told him to add a 33rd shvach, that the Ramah wore a mask on Purim. Shvach for the Ramah. Why? Because the entire miracle of Purim comes through masks, through guises. And our ability to defeat Amalek is because we figured out how they wear masks and how they appear as animals and how they appear. What was the? They appear as animals, or they appear as knanim to mess up at tefillos and all. It's all about guises. It's all about facades. And if that be the case, Rabbosai, here's the punchline of today's shir. How many do I have? 15 minutes? Okay, I hope I can fit it into 15 minutes. What we're about to learn is an unbelievable chiddush, which I couldn't have known anywhere except Hegyonei Halacha from Reb Chaim Pelagi. Reb Chaim Pelagi, I have here books by him and about him here right behind my back. Reb Chaim Pelagi writes about the Gorol of Haman. Listen carefully. How Gedolei Yisrael analyze and dissect a Gorol, a lottery. He says, number one, then when it says hipil pur, what does that mean, hipil? Hipil, to throw something, right? Hapil. He says it's all about dice, but they had special dice that they used for lotteries. The year that Haman threw the dice, so to speak, hipil pur, the lottery, that was Adar Sheni, right? In a month from now, that would correspond to the Adar of the lottery of Haman. How do we know this? Vushtetas. How do you know that it was Adar Sheni? So the pasuk says in Megillas Esther, miyom liyom, michodesh lechodesh, shnei masar hu chodesh Adar. So the Yerushalmi says, wait a minute. Why are you telling me that it was chodesh shnei masar hu chodesh Adar? Lama period akasuv, the Yerushalmi asks, lechodesh shnei masar hu chodesh Adar. I mean, we know that the 12th month of the year, of the Hebrew calendar, is chodesh Adar. The pasuk didn't have to go ahead and identify it as a Adar. Says the Yerushalmi lelamdecha shahaya zeh bechodesh hashlosh asar. It was not in the 12th month. It was in the 13th month. Shebechol shana v'shana chodesh hashnei masar. This would have been on a normal year, shnei masar. So we read it like this. When you read the pasuk according to the Yerushalmi, you read it like this: miyom liyom, michodesh lechodesh, shebechol shana hu shnei masar hu chodesh Adar. It was on that month that in a normal year would have been month number 12. So you mamish have the word shebechol shana v'shana. It would be shnei masar. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted the lottery to fall on the 12th, on the 13th month on Adar Sheni. And why? Because Haman was Mizera Amalek, and he was a Mechashek. And the power of Adar Sheni is the power that detonates the power of Kisha. But that's only the beginning of it. Says Reb Chaim Pelaji, Chazal tell us that this is based on a medrash in Esther Rabbah, that Olav Nafal Hagorah. Okay, so we have this dice, which is called a kubiyah, right? Like the Gemara says, Masachik b'kubiyah, right? Kubiyah. What was the kubiyah? How did they do this? The kubiyah had numbers on both sides. Now, when you throw the dice down and it hits the ground, then the number on the bottom that hits the ground, when added to the number on top, which is on the surface that you see, always equals 7. Okay. Now, what happens is that if you throw the dice and you see the number 2, what number is hitting the ground below it? 5, right? Because 5 plus 2 is 7. Okay. Now Haman throws the dice, and he throws it 3 times. What numbers does he see on top of the dice? He sees 3 on the first round, 3 again on the second round, and 1, the number 1. So Haman adds together the following numbers: 1, 3, and 3. Those numbers in Hebrew letters are Aleph, Gimel, Gimel, which spells Agag, the great-grandfather of Haman. Haman is elated. He's dancing in the sky because he sees that there is a divine okay for him to destroy the Jewish people, and the mazel here is the mazel of Agag. Haman samach belibo, shera sheshvar mazolo sha'olo begoro begematrio shel zikno Agag. Okay, now on both sides, let's turn the dice to the other side. Okay? So you've got 1, you've got 3, and you've got 3. On the flip side, Keneged Pnei HaKarka of the 1 is what? 6, right? On the flip side of a 3 is what?
4.
It's 4. And the flip side of another 3 is 4. 4 plus 4 plus 6 is how much?
14.
14. Okay, now we're going to take the name David, and we'll see why we choose David. David is 4 plus 4, the last Dalet, and 6 in the middle is again 8 plus 6 is 14, correct? What Haman didn't realize was that the real winner of this lottery was not Agag, but rather David. Why David? Because Haman bikesh larog la'ashmid la'abnes kol Yehudim. And this was Haman's wonderful plan to undermine and destroy the prophecy of Yirmiyahu HaNavi. Yirmiyahu HaNavi said, that after 70 years I will remember them, and I will bring them back to Yerushalayim, to Ir David, to the city of David. And Yerushalayim is always called by the name David. For example, in Malachim Aleph Perek Ches, we're on page 159 if you're following me. Min hayom asher otzeisi es ami es Yisrael miMitzrayim lo bacharti be'ir mikol shiftei Yisrael livnos bayis leo shmi sham avchar b'David leos li le'ami. It doesn't make any sense. The entire pasuk is talking about God's choosing an ear, a city, amongst all shiftei Yisrael. And then the pasuk goes on to say, and I chose David. What do you mean you chose David? David is not a city. But the answer is that David is a city. David represents Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim and David are one and the same. So that when Haman was dancing in the air, elated over the fact that the lottery turned out to have Agag on it, and now the Nevuah of Yirmiyahu HaNavi is not going to come to fruition, and there will not be a rebuilding of Jerusalem. What he didn't know was that the real totza'ah, the outcome of this Torah was David, which means Yerushalayim, which means that Yerushalayim will be rebuilt. And Reb Chaim Pelagi quotes a Yalkut in Tehillim, which is in Tehillim Kapitel Kuf Vav. It says, Zachrani Hashem b'rtzon amecha. And the Medrash says on this pasuk in Tehillim, Omar David, Ribono shel olam, kshetase Yeshuos al yedei Mordechai, Zachrani, when you will bring about a redemption and a miracle through Mordechai, remember me. Vapur shehipil Haman olav nafal, the poor fell out on David. So when God was bringing about this miracle, that the poor would mean that the plans of Haman would be foiled and Yerushalayim would be rebuilt, it was a poor of David. This is what we call v'nahafochu. Turn the kubiyah upside down. From Agag, turn it into David, into Yerushalayim. Shegoral Agag hafach Hashem Yisparach Leos David Leos Yerushalayim. V'shavu Yisrael migolus paras Bavel le'ir David Yerushalayim ubanu beis hamikdash hasheni. This is the great miracle of Purim, of an afochu, that the lottery is turned the other way around. Instead of Agag, it's Yerushalayim, it's David HaMelech. Zachreni Hashem b'rtzon amecha. When you have ratzon for your people, remember me, says David. And that's at the time of the Yeshua of Mordechai. And we begin to understand and appreciate why the name of this holiday is Purim. And we know Sukkot is Anani HaKoved, and Pesach al Shem Posach Hashem b'Botei B'nei Yisrael b'Mitzrayim, Chanukah is al Shem Chanukah Mizbeach, but Purim is on the lottery of Haman. Why? And the answer is, according to Chaim Pelagic, because the poor of Haman was a great miracle, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu turned it the other way around. And Haman thought it was the Goral of Agag. And really, in truth, it was the Goral of David and Yerushalayim, V'nafochu, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hipech HaKuvya, he turned the Kuvya the other side. V'nefach HaPur Lipurenu. It's our poor, not Haman's poor. It's our poor. Don't think for a moment that Purim means Haman's poor. It's not. Haman's poor fell out on Agag, but our poor, the poor of an Afochu of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is our poor, and it fell out on David, which is Yerushalayim, which is Yeshua. And we end up on page 160. B'divrei Chasidim. And Rabbosai, if you have time, I would love to introduce the next chapter about Amalek, if you have time. You know, there's a book called Sefer Tamei HaMinhagim. It's a Hasidic book that tries to explain various dimensions of the Minhagim based on Hasidus. Now, in Hasidus, one of the most fundamental distinctions is between what's called Isarusa Dili Ela and Isarusa Dili Tata, meaning God taking the initiative, man is passive, and man taking the initiative, and God, Kaviyachol, is passive. Having said that, Tamei HaMinhagim wants to understand the difference between two minhagim, that of Chanukah and that of Purim. On Chanukah, we spin the dreidel. On Purim, we turn around the grog. What's the difference? So the Tamei HaMinhagim asks, why is on Chanukah we hold the dreidel from on top and we spin the bottom? On Purim, we hold the graga on the bottom and we turn it around on top. So the Tamei HaMinhagim, quoting the Dinover, what's his name, the Dinover? Okay, I forget his name right now. A very famous Hasidic Rebbe from Dinov. Can anybody help me with that? Okay. I'm sure you've all heard of it, but you know it by a different name. Anyway, so he says the following. Chanukah is all about Isarusa Dili Ela. Why? Because who showed up for the battle against the Yevonim? It was a handful of Jews, of Kashmanoim and a couple of their, besides the glorious brothers, a couple of their friends. It was it all came from above, from Shemayim. And therefore we hold the dreidel. What?
Spira.
No.
Family name.
Oh, could be. I don't remember his family name, but what great work did he write that we all know? He wrote a calendar.
B'nai Yissaschar.
Oh, the B'nai Yissaschar. Excellent. So the B'nai Yissaschar says the following. Chanukah is the Bechina of Isarusa Dili Ela, and that's why we grab the dreidel on top. But Purim, it's Lech Knotzes Kol Yehudim, Vitzumo Alai, Shlosha Yomim. It's all about the tfilos and the tshuvos of Klal Yisrael that change the destiny and undermine the decree of Haman. And therefore it's Isarusa Dilitata. And that's why we hold the graga on the bottom. And he explains that that's why when it comes to Purim, we're talking about Kimu V'Kiblu, which is again, it's Arusa Dilitata. The first set of Luchos was all Kaf Aleim Harkigigas from the Lamala, and also the mitzvah of Mishloach Manos Ish L'Reyehu. That's all an expression of his Harusa, of his Orushal Klal. And he ends with the following. On Purim, we say, after the Megillah, Harav es Rivenu. On Chanukah, in the Alanisim, we say, Ravta es Rivam. Why the difference? He says the answer is that Rivenu, we are taking the initiative. It's Arusa Dilatata on Purim, and therefore it's Rivenu. God is coming to help our Riv, whereas on Hanukkah, it's all the Ribbono Shalom. It's not Rivenu. So for anyone who could stay for another 5-10 minutes, just a quick introduction to the next section. I don't remember whether David sent out page 161. Can anybody? Yes, he did. Excellent. So you'll see on page 161 the issue of Kabbalah's Geirus.
Just one point to
please.
on the one of the problems that I have with the whole shot in the poor is that they didn't do tshuva yet. In other words, the Shleisha Yomim fast and all that Esther told them to really do tshuva came later. So how's the poor?
Well, I think, Bobby, that depends upon the machlokes about Tainus Esther. When exactly did Tainus Esther take place? One shita says Esther gathered together the people for 3 days before she went into Achashverosh, before Balayla Hu Nodosh Rasabel. The other opinion pushes it forward by whatever it is, 11 months, and that's when they went out to battle, and they fasted before they went out to battle. So we're going now with that shita that this brought about the Yeshua because they fasted and prayed and did tshuva before Esther went in to plead the case in front of Achashverosh. But by way of introduction to the next essay, what is this mitzvah that only applies to battle against one nation, and that's the mitzvah of Zechiras Amalek? In other words, we have to remember why we're going against Amalek. And we have to recite a parsha in the Torah that's called Zechira B'Peh, which is the mitzvah of Zechiras Amalek that's fulfilled on Shabbos Zohar. And that's unique to the mitzvah of destroying Amalek. It doesn't apply, like, for example, Zion Amamin, we don't have a mitzvah of Zechira with regard to the 7 nations. So in order to answer this question, we're going to study a very, very challenging Mechilta. Mechilta is otherwise known as the Toras Kohanim if it's on Sefer Vayikra. And the Mechilta says that in the name of Rabbi Lazar, Nishba HaMakom, God took a shvua, Bakise, he held on to the Kisei. Im Yavo Echad Mikol HaMolos, Mikol HaUmos Litzkayer, anyone who comes from any of the nations of the world and he wants to become Jewish, Nikabluhu. But Amalek, Lo Nikabluhu. We will not accept a member of Amalek as a ger. Now, how does Rabbi Lazar in the Mechilta prove that we don't accept Gerim from Amalek? Shenemar, you remember the parsha of the death of Shaul HaMelech, and Shaul fell on his own cherev, and a nar, a young man, comes in front of David. Vayomer David al nar hamayt mi zeh ata. Who are you? Identify yourself. Vayomer, and the pasuk says in Shmuel Beis Perikal, Ben ish ger Amaleki anoch. I am the son of a convert Amaleki, an Amaleki who converted to Judaism. Nizkar David, at that moment, David reminded himself of the shvuah that we mentioned before, the name Rabbi Lazar, that we could take and accept Gerim from every nation except for Amalek. Amalek lo nikablu. Vayomer lo David. David turns to this nar and he says, you've brought about your own death. You have signed and sealed the death sentence for yourself. Ki picha inabach, anabach. Your mouth has given us the answer. And the Medrash concludes by saying, L'kach nemar milchamal Hashem Amalek midar dar. And this is referring to the dar of Shaul and David. And David puts this nar to death. What is going on over here? This Mechilta is making a halachic statement that we don't accept gerim from Amalek, and it's quoting psukim. And it seems that the Mechilta understood from these psukim that the reason why David killed this Nar is because of the mitzvah of destroying Amalek. Because he says to him, well, you're a ben ger Amaleki, we don't accept gerim from Amalek, and therefore you are an Amaleki, and I'll have you killed. So the reason why David killed the Nar is because of the mitzvah Mechias Amalek. Now, again, it says that he was a ben ger, so it must mean that it was a gerus that was not halachically acceptable, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu took a shvua b'kisei hakavod that we don't accept gerim from Amalek, and therefore he remains this Nar an Amaleki, and therefore he was put to death by David. How can you understand the Tanakh this way? The pasuk says, take a look on the bottom of 161. Vayomer ben ish ger Amaleki Anochi. Vayomer love David. Eich lo yareso l'shloach yadcha l'shaches es Mashiach Hashem. This Nar admittedly killed Shaul. Shaul asked him to please put me to death, and that's what the Nar did. And Vayikra David li'echad ben Anorim Vayomer gash po. Ukabo vayakeu vayamos vayomer love David damchal roshcha kipicha in honor b'chal lemar anochi mosasi as Mashiach Hashem. You, by your own admission, killed the king, Mashiach Hashem, and therefore you have to be killed. So it comes out that David in the Psukim killed the Nar Amaleki as a rotzeach. The man was a murderer. He killed the king by his own admission. He's chayav misa. How could the Mechilta see in this parsha that David killed him for the mitzvah of Mechias Amalek? And furthermore, how could the Mechilta say that we're not makabel gerim from Amalek, and David killed the Nar Amaleki in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Mechias Amalek? And the Mechilta proves this from Damchal Roshcha Kipicha Ina Bach. So the Mechilta is quoting the pasuk Picha Ina Bach, which means you're admitting that you're an Amaleki. But the pasuk says Picha Inach Bach Lemar Anochi Masasi Es Mashiach Hashem. So it's very nice that the Mechilta quotes the three words Picha Anabach as if to say you admit that you're an Amaleki, but that's not what the pasuk is talking about. The pasuk says you admit that you killed the Mashiach Hashem. That's what the pasuk says. That David killed him because he, the Amaleki, this Nar, had killed Shaul HaMelech. So how could the Mechilta bring that pasuk as a raya when the pasuk indicates clearly that he was killed because he was a murderer and he had killed the Melech B'Yisrael, he had killed Shaul? So Mirz Hashem, we'll finish this up next week, and we'll be able to hopefully put this all together, but I'm excited because I think we really covered a lot of new ideas here for today. And then everyone should have a great week.
By the way, Roberto, I was thinking that maybe my question, you could say that's part of the Benahapachu. In other words, the Gar really came out of Gog, but by the tshuva of Klal Yisrael, the Benahapachu, the Gar really was the opposite.
Correct. Excellent. Absolutely.
Words, even what you said, that the tshuva came later still than the Gairal. Even whichever way you learn the fasting. But
the Vanafachu was a result of the tshuva. To transform a Gzera and a poor of Agag to a poor of David. And it's not the number 7, but rather the number 14. Okay then, call 2.